I don't know about all of you, but I miss the Zelda timeline. It's a great part of Zelda's lore, and I made a separate video on why connecting to the wider Zelda universe makes for much better stories than just ignoring the timeline and starting from scratch every time. We do now seem to be at least having some luck on that front, since Echoes of Wisdom now not only connects to the larger Zelda universe, but also has some serious lore bombs. Echoes of Wisdom has not only gone a definitive timeline placement, it also has a lot of details about the world, which inferred that it takes place between A Link Between Worlds and Zelda 1 long before it was officially confirmed that that was its placement. Although there were also a lot of people coming up with alternative theories for where it takes place, and I love that. I love that we can properly theorize about this stuff again after Tears of the Kingdom just decided to stomp all over the lore of every Zelda game that came before. Even the game that it's supposed to be a sequel to. But I do suppose the timeline is pretty convoluted, and I can't blame the developers for wanting to start fresh. However, everyone still loves and remembers each of these older games, and many people are playing them for the first time today, thanks to the series' newfound popularity. Heck, I'm one of those people. I wasn't able to get into Zelda at all before Tears of the Kingdom, but then after I beat Tears of the Kingdom, I did Link Between Worlds, then Link's Awakening, then Ocarina of Time, then Wind Waker, then Majora's Mask, Minish Cap. I'm on Twilight Princess right now, and I think it's my favorite one yet. People still love the old timeline, so they can't exactly just ignore it to follow a much worse rebooted one. Especially since Echoes of Wisdom appears to take place in the old timeline, so they're still acknowledging the old timeline while keeping track of this new one that vaguely takes place really far in the future, but other than that is mostly its own thing. So now, by running this semi-rebooted timeline alongside the old timeline, they've essentially just created a fourth branch of the timeline that just says, fuck you, to the other branches rather than connecting to them. So yeah, that's not fun. That's not fun. It only makes things worse. These new games and stories are only made worse without a connection to the timeline. They feel derivative and redo a lot of the same story beats that we've seen before time and time again. But there is a way to salvage this. There's a way to connect these newer games to the classic Zelda titles, which would manage to keep the old lore intact and still let them do whatever they want with the franchise here in the distant future of the timeline. There is a way to give the Zelda timeline one last shebang that everyone would love, and then be allowed to move on from it forever and keep going in this new era of the timeline that takes place in the distant future. I am, of course, talking about the idea of a timeline convergence. The idea that at some point after the events of each of these games in the main timeline, all three of these timelines merged into one single timeline. Now, of course, this may seem like a ludicrous and impossible thing to make happen, even in a fantasy universe. How could three universes become one universe if it just doesn't make any sense? But it's not as impossible as you might think. The Arrowverse's Crisis on Infinite Earths did a very similar thing, where the multiverse was destroyed, but then the heroes went back to the dawn of time and restarted the universe, leading to the creation of Earth Prime, a combined version of each of their respective universes. Zelda could absolutely do something similar, although hopefully without being as stupid as the Arrowverse often tends to be. And it would honestly solve most of the lore inconsistencies seen in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. How do the Rito exist alongside the Zora? How are the Rito and Koroks here at all when Hyrule is dry land? How come legacy items from the games in all three timelines exist in this version of Hyrule? All that stuff is solved. Heck, since three different versions of the same kingdom magically converging into one would, let's be real, it would probably be a cataclysmic event. Especially since one of those kingdoms is just straight up an ocean now. It could even explain how the Kingdom of Hyrule could have been destroyed so that Rauru and Sonia would be able to refound it in the distant past of Tears of the Kingdom. Since the Hyrule we see in these Dragon Tears seem to certainly have more in common with the Wild Era's Hyrule than the Hyrule that was founded after Skyward Sword. Plus, then we also don't have to worry about there being two different Ganondorfs at once, because this one would have reincarnated ages after Ocarina of Time Ganondorf did his thing. Because this whole thing would be a refounding, not the actual original founding of Hyrule. Overall, I like this idea. I find it to be an awesome way to tie together a lot of Zelda lore. It lets the Wild Era games finally connect to what we have now, and I think it would be a great way to give us one last hurrah for the old Zelda timeline before everything gets set in the Wild Era from here on out. But here's the thing. If this were to become the actual canon explanation for what happened to allow Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom to become a thing, it can't just be something we're told about and then left at that. An occurrence in Zelda lore of this magnitude, 3 worlds converging into one, absolutely needs a game to cover it. Of course, not that the Zelda devs would ever do such a thing, as even considering an idea like this would mean that the game's story would be the first thing they would have to discuss when coming up with new ideas for Zelda games, which the Zelda team very much does not do. They always consider gameplay first, and then cobble together the story whenever convenient. Echoes of Wisdom's story was written during a 9-day boot camp only a year before the game was released. And most of that was done by Aonuma himself in one night after Grezzo didn't have that much suggestions. But say the main big idea that the devs have for the next Zelda game is to further push the boundaries of the open world is universe hopping. And they decided to make 3 different versions of the world that the player could explore through, and then when the time came to think of a proper story, Aonuma pulls out his Hyrule Historia for reference, and a light bulb goes off above his head, then maybe this could happen. As long as there are 3 different worlds to explore, and one of those worlds is an ocean conveniently, then yeah, I guess maybe this could happen. So then, how would we go about making this exactly? Many people keep saying that this kind of game would be cool, but I don't ever see anyone actually thinking it through. Well, for one, most obviously, you'd have to spend the game traveling between all 3 different versions of Hyrule. You can't just spend the whole game in one version of Hyrule and then just have it collide with other versions near the end after you've just heard about them a bit. Nor can the game be set post-Convergence after all the timelines have already merged into one off-screen. That would be lame. No, if we're going to have a game that's specifically focused on the Zelda timeline and its branches, then each of the different timelines need to have their own part in the game. I'm thinking you start in one timeline, most likely the Child timeline, since that timeline was left off the best after things split. You'd start in this timeline, and then about a third of the way through the game, you'd get some item that let you travel across time, like the Ocarina of Time, or maybe just the Master Sword, and then unlock both of the other timelines and get to see versions of Hyrule that weren't so lucky in the fight against Ganon. In the adult timeline, Hyrule has of course been flooded and many of the Great Sea's inhabitants have left for a different continent by now. In the Downfall timeline, while this map would still somewhat resemble the map in the Link of the Past, this would take place not long after the Era of Decline, and the Kingdom of Hyrule would be in less than ideal condition when you arrive. Oh, and of course, many of you are probably wondering how the heck the Downfall timeline would even exist here, since it's more of a what-if scenario than an actual timeline like the adult and child timelines are. This is true, but there are a boatload of different theories that describe exactly how this timeline could have fit in with the others. Maybe the Downfall timeline was actually the version of Hyrule that Link had to travel back to multiple times during Ocarina of Time in order to do the Spirit Temple in the bottom of the well. And when he went back to the future, he left that version of Hyrule without a hero, which allowed Ganondorf to win in the end. Maybe when Link traveled back to change things at the end of Ocarina of Time, it caused a glitch in time itself, and accidentally created another alternate reality where Link failed to beat Ganon. Maybe an alternate timeline was also created in Ocarina of Time when Link grabbed the Master Sword and went forward in time. Maybe going forward in time also created an alternate timeline alongside going back. Maybe Link originally fought Ganon when he was 10 and lost, so Zelda sent a message back in time to Rauru saying that Link wasn't ready and needed to be held in stasis until he grew old enough to win. Who knows? Any of these explanations could work, really. I'm going to go with the abandoned timeline theory that says that the timeline Link went back to in order to beat the Spirit Temple was the Downfall timeline, but you can all take your pick. That brings us to how exactly we get the timelines to merge at the end of this game. Now, they could probably invent some brand new MacGuffin that allows this to happen, but from what we know right now, I'm fairly certain the only item in the Zelda universe that could do something as huge and seemingly impossible as this would be the Triforce. If someone in your universe can make an unrestricted god-level wish and have it come true, then the only real limit behind this wish is what the writer is capable of writing. So even if the idea of timelines merging somehow is kinda shaky on how exactly it would even work, which I'll go over later, that won't matter if it's done by the all-powerful god-level wish-granting MacGuffin that is the Triforce. However, if all it takes to merge the timelines is getting the Triforce, then there's no real reason to have to go to the other timelines as well. So I'd like to propose this parameter be put in place in order to complicate things. In order to make a wish that affects all of the timelines, you need to have the full Triforce from each of the timelines. In other words, if this game's villain wants to converge the timelines, then they'll need to wish on all 3 complete Triforces at once. A Triforce of Triforces, if you will. The complete Triforce from every different timeline. This means that the different MacGuffins you'll be getting from beating each dungeon will be one of the Triforce pieces from that respective timeline. The Adult and Downfall timelines will each have 3 dungeons with 1 shard of the Triforce each, and it's up to you to get them before the enemy does. As for the Triforce of your timeline, it will, unfortunately, fall into enemy hands very early on, and you'll instead spend the first part of the game trying to get the keys to the Master Sword and or whatever MacGuffin you'll need to travel across the timelines. Now, of course, we must make it clear how this timeline convergence works exactly. 3 different universes merging into one doesn't exactly sound conventionally feasible, after all. I already cited Crisis on Infinite Earths as an example of how exactly something like this could happen, but I think I'd rather take a different approach at this since Earth Prime was an intact restoration of the destroyed multiverse, while here, the Convergence will be a cataclysmic event brought on by the game's villain. So I think the way this would work would be that when the timelines converge, anything unique or in a unique position would transfer over. This includes buildings, individual objects, people, and unique formations in the terrain. A lot of these objects or buildings would overlap in the same space after the timelines merge, and of course, them suddenly occupying the same position would cause a ton of destruction. However, while Hyrule's populated surface will experience all this overlap, repeated parts of terrain, such as the never-ending mountain of stone and dirt that makes up the planet's crust, will not transfer over during the convergence. Instead, the terrain will just stay as it was in one of the timelines, and all the repeating dirt and stone in the other 2 timelines will simply disappear. As for the Great Sea in the adult timeline, I'd say about 10% of the water would transfer over, and the other 90% would disappear. This is because if all of the water from the Great Sea transferred over, then it would just completely flood the newly converged Hyrule until it was just the Great Sea again, and the other 2 timelines would just have very little effect on the convergence, while the adult timeline would remain mostly unchanged. It would basically just be another Great Flood. So instead, only some of the water from the Great Sea will transfer over to the converged world. That way, instead of becoming a full-on ocean again, Hyrule ends up turning into something like a swamp after the convergence. And all of the Wind Waker's islands either turn into mountains or end up being ground level with the rest of the converged world. Now, there is probably plenty of other ways to do this whole convergence thing, but this is how I think the timelines could be merged. This is how I would handle it. Here's something of important note. While calling them the adult timeline, child timeline, and downfall timeline works from the perspective of an outsider playing these games, I feel like we need a much better name for them in-universe. So I would like to propose that the child timeline be referred to as the timeline of the hero, because it's the timeline that the hero returned to while the other 2 were left without one. Then the adult timeline should be called the timeline of the gods, since that's the timeline where the gods themselves had to step in and change the landscape of Hyrule itself to stop Ganondorf. And the downfall timeline should be called the timeline of darkness, since that was the timeline where Ganon won. Note that each of these timelines would now represent a certain member of the Triforce Trifecta. The timeline of the hero for Link, the timeline of the gods for Zelda, and the timeline of darkness for Ganon. Now we have to discuss who the villain of the story is, and why exactly they'd want to merge the timelines to begin with. Since, obviously, it wouldn't be the hero who'd be doing this, as the 3 different universes magically converging into one would be a cataclysmic event that would most likely destroy the kingdom. Frankly, for a game this big with such a massive effect on the Zelda universe, I can't see it being anyone other than some incarnation of Ganon. Unless they were to have Demise be resurrected for this game and have him do it, since he's definitely enough of a big shot for a story like this, but I doubt that would happen. No, this is gonna be a Ganon game. That's for certain. In fact, there's probably not going to be that much new lore stuff in this game in general, since it would function best as a celebration of the entire series that builds off of what has come before. And that would also probably mean that this probably shouldn't be the next 3D Zelda game, because Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom were all very samey lore-wise, so the next Zelda game should probably be something... Actually, no, not probably. It should definitely be something that takes place in a different kingdom, but once we return to Hyrule after that, this game. This is the game that we should get. Timeline Convergence. Let's do this. This is how you make Hyrule interesting again. But the problem is, Ganon's become something of a stale villain as of late. After Twilight Princess, the devs realized that they milked him a little bit too much, and he was starting to become oversaturated, so they gave Ganondorf a break for a while, and when they did bring him back, it was always with some kind of twist. Spirit Tracks had Malladus, a very similar villain, but not Ganon. Skyward Sword had Demise, the ancient demon lord whose curse allowed Ganon to exist. Both A Link Between Worlds and Echoes of Wisdom have Ganon being controlled and working as a supporting villain for a different bad guy. And then Breath of the Wild gave us Calamity Ganon, a dark force of nature who used to be Ganon long ago, but has since degraded into this monstrosity. Hyrule Warriors and Cadence of Hyrule both have the real deal, but those were just spin-offs. So then when Tears of the Kingdom came out 17 long years after Twilight Princess, they decided that it had been more than enough time and that they were clear to use Ganondorf again. So they did just that, and nope, it didn't work. It didn't matter that it had been so long since Ganondorf's last appearance. His presence here was still just derivative. They did nothing new with him. A lot of what we got with this new reincarnation was just a boring retread of what we've seen before. And the fact that Calamity Ganon was just his power leaking from his seal is so much less cool than the idea that Ganondorf somehow evolved into this monstrosity after thousands of years and several revivals. Sure, I'm sure that they could have done just a few minor improvements with Ganondorf here, and that would have been enough to fix him. Tears of the Kingdom story is pretty bad in general, so it's no wonder that Ganondorf wasn't very unique. And even then, Ganondorf's appearance in Tears was still pretty cool, and his lack of uniqueness isn't that bad simply because it's been so long since his last appearance in Twilight Princess. But here's the thing. While Ganondorf's appearance in Tears of the Kingdom could have been made more interesting with just a few changes, that won't be the case for another appearance. Now that we've seen this much more generic version of Ganondorf, the damage has been done. Getting just another Ganondorf appearance that's been given some improvements and unique elements over his last appearance is going to feel even more derivative than Tears of the Kingdom's Ganondorf, because there hasn't been a 17-year wait since the last time he's shown up. We still have a bad taste in our mouth from just getting another Ganondorf. So if this game is going to have Ganon as the villain, then it's going to need to make this one of the most absolutely unique versions of Ganon seen yet. One that gives us a completely new take on the character. Something on par with that time Bowser turned himself into a castle. Although I guess Calamity Ganon already took that angle, so we'll need a different approach. So here's what I'm thinking. Make Ganondorf a child. This would be another reincarnation rather than just the same Ganondorf as before, but this would be handled much differently from Tears of the Kingdom in that this newly born Ganondorf's connection to the old Ganondorf would be a massive focal point, as would his connection to the Gerudo. When this new Ganondorf was born, the Gerudo people were worried that he was a reincarnation of the original Ganondorf, so when he reached the age of 10, they either exiled him or they tried to execute him, but he escaped. After this, young Ganondorf wanted revenge, so he snuck back into the desert and dug up a few old sorcery books belonging to two long-dead Gerudo witches, implied to be the twin witches, Tome and Kotake, who raised the first Ganondorf. After then using these books to teach himself this dark sorcery and gaining the power of gloom, he tracks down the Triforce of Power, and he uses its power to merge with the spirit of the previous Ganondorf who came before him. This process transforms him into Beast Ganon, because, let's be real, a 10-year-old boy isn't exactly intimidating. And it provides him with the memories belonging to the previous Ganondorf. And these memories come from the Ganon of all 3 different timelines. This is how Ganon finds out about the existence of the 3 different timelines. He gets them from the memories of the previous Ganondorf. Ganon is now driven by both his childish yet monumental hatred towards the Gerudo for casting him out, and the general hatred, malice, and lust for power that was harbored by the old Ganondorf. With this drive, Ganon comes up with a plan to exact his vengeance on the whole world, by stealing the complete Triforce from all 3 timelines and using it to converge them into one timeline, thus causing a cataclysm great enough to exact his revenge on the entire multiverse, yet still leaving enough of a world left for him to rule over once the dust settles. Previously, in the Child Timeline, or the Timeline of the Hero, as this game would call it, Link and Zelda inherited their pieces of the Triforce from the hero and princess from Ocarina of Time. And since they still have those pieces at the end of Twilight Princess, I'm going to say that their descendants, aka the Link and Zelda of this game, would inherit their pieces of the Triforce as well. So not long after young Ganondorf turns into Ganon, Princess Zelda and her personal knight Link will hear from the Gerudo of Ganon's turmoil. This will of course happen after Link gets appointed as Zelda's personal knight after like a whole prologue sequence. It would be a whole thing, we can't just jump into it with Link already being a knight. Zelda's meant to be a hero's journey. So then they'll track down and confront Ganon in this game's prologue. However, Ganon will manage to win this first battle, extract the Triforce pieces from Link and Zelda, and obtain the complete Triforce of the Timeline of the Hero. All within the first hour or 2 of the game. The complete Triforce gives Ganon the power to send his demonic minions to the other timelines in order to get him the complete Triforce of those timelines as well, but since leaving this timeline would mean leaving behind its Triforce, he's unable to chase after them himself. So instead, Ganon holds up in the Sacred Realm, where the barrier between timelines is at its weakest, and he sends his monsters into the Timeline of Darkness and the Timeline of the Gods, so that they can seize the other 2 complete Triforces for him. Okay, at this point we've just gone into this game's story as a whole, so I'll just keep going with how I think this game should handle its story. After Link and Zelda lose their Triforce pieces to Ganon, Zelda instructs Link to track down the 3 Spiritual Stones so he can obtain the Master Sword, which should help him stop Ganon. As per classic Zelda, maybe they could add in some new stuff to spice this up, since this has been done many times before. I'm rating this as like a celebration of the entirety of Zelda, but since Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild were so samey lore-wise, they should probably add in some new stuff as well. I'm not quite sure where to fit it in. This is just a base outline of the game. It's a rough draft. After Link gets the Spiritual Stones and pulls the Master Sword, he gets pulled into the Sacred Realm and finds himself standing before the Ancient Sages, who tell him about the other timelines and about how elsewhere in the realm, Ganon is plotting and controlling his demonic puppets of the other 2 timelines. Since the Sacred Realm is where the timeline barrier is at its weakest, Link would then have access to the Timeline of Darkness and the Timeline of the Gods from here. And not long after, he'd get the Ocarina of Time, which he can use to jump between the timelines without having to go back to the Temple of Time first. From there, he'd have to get all 3 pieces of the Triforce out of the dungeons in both timelines. And of course, all 6 dungeons from this section would be completable in any order. All 3 dungeons, both timelines, complete them in whatever order you want. Open air Zelda, baby. Although the dungeons containing the Triforce of Power would be the most difficult ones by far, and would have Ganon's most powerful servants waiting for you at the end. Also, as an extra way to get new lore, when you get a piece of the Triforce, you get to have a conversation with the person it represents. Getting the Triforce of Wisdom lets you call back to Princess Zelda in your home timeline. Getting the Triforce of Power has you converse with Ganon, and you get to have a little conversation with the game's villain and get a little more insight on his motivation and all that. And getting the Triforce of Courage allows you to commune with the Ancient Hero of Time, who was the one that split the timeline to begin with. Once you clear all these dungeons, you've successfully reunited the complete Triforce in both the Timeline of Darkness and the Timeline of the Gods, aka the Adult and Downfall timelines, and kept them both from the clutches of Ganon's minions. However, there's a problem. With Ganon still having 1 complete Triforce, he's able to use it to reach out to the other 2 pieces now that they've both been completed as well, and he can make his wish that way. However, this process takes time, even more so than it otherwise would have since you kept the pieces safe from his minions. So you'll have to storm Ganon's lair in the Sacred Realm to stop him from making the switch. However, right when you make it to the top of Ganon's tower, Ganon manages to stall you by summoning a boss for you to fight, and he ends up succeeding in making his wish on all 3 Triforces. Link gets spat back out into his timeline in Hyrule Castle, next to Princess Zelda, just in time to bear witness to chaos. Buildings and trees and houses and mountains suddenly start appearing in the same space as one another. People randomly appear on the streets, their homes phased inside of other people's homes. Locations, which existed with slight differences in all 3 timelines, including Hyrule Castle, suddenly have all 3 versions occupying the same space, which turns these locations into a weird amalgamation of the structure and landmasses they once were. And then the water hits. Hundreds of gallons of water from the timeline of the gods suddenly wash over Hyrule. Not nearly as much as it was in the original Great Sea, because then that would undercut what's happening here by just turning it into another Great Flood, but still no small amount, as this chaotic overlapping Kingdom of Hyrule has now become a treacherous swamp. With the wish completed, the Triforce splits into 3 again, with its pieces going back to Link, Zelda, and Ganon. The convergence is complete. You have failed. Hyrule Castle was elevated enough to be spared from the flooding, and now it's just a mishmash amalgamation of 3 different Hyrule Castles overlapping one another that sits over a chaotic overlapping Hyrulean swampland. Ganon exits the Sacred Realm and sits atop the highest point of merged Hyrule Castle, overlooking his newly converged world. Link and Zelda now climb merged Hyrule Castle, the final dungeon of the game, with one goal in mind: destroy Ganon so he cannot rule over this twisted new world he's created. Once you reach Ganon, you begin a 3-phase boss fight. In the first phase, Ganon actually reverts back to young Ganondorf again, and you fight him as a 10-year-old. Although this phase is fairly quick, and it's only for Ganondorf to gauge how powerful you are before he goes all out. It's still not easy though, as even in child form, Ganondorf's magic is strong. After this, he turns back into Ganon for phase 2, complete with an overextended health bar. Zelda would have been stuck behind a gloom barrier for the first phase, but here she's able to help you in the battle against Ganon. Then, at the end of this phase, you send Ganon flying, and he lands in the merged Temple of Time. There, he goes to the entrance of the Sacred Realm, uses his piece of the Triforce to draw the power out, and then he uses that power to break his piece of the Triforce open. This causes his magic to surge uncontrollably, and he begins to mutate. Link and Zelda watch from a distance as Ganon's expanding magical power grows to a gargantuan size and manifests itself into a living being. This is Ganon's 3rd phase, his phase which is more about an awesome spectacle than an actual challenge, although it would still definitely be harder than the final phases in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. This final phase is Calamity Ganon. I always thought it would be cool if normal Ganon / Ganondorf turned into Calamity Ganon as his final phase, just like how Ganondorf turned into Ganon at the end of Ocarina of Time, so I'm doing that here. Oh, and just FYI, this is not the Calamity Ganon from 10,000 years before Breath of the Wild, since there are no Guardians or Divine Beasts here. This is its own separate thing from the Calamity in the Ancient Mural. Maybe it's the events that caused the people 10,000 years ago to know what Calamity Ganon was, so they could prepare by building the Divine Beasts when they heard the prophecy. Or maybe it's just unrelated entirely. I don't know. In this fight, there's no way to damage Calamity Ganon. So what Link and Zelda need to do is get around Ganon's massive body and go into the Temple of Time behind him, where Zelda can use the Sacred Realm and the Triforce of Wisdom to do the same thing Ganon did, and break her piece of the Triforce open so her magic surges uncontrollably and manifests as a physical gargantuan being. This turns her into Calamity Zelda, something I've also always thought would be totally awesome to see after watching them both turn into dragons. Calamity Zelda defeats and subsequently obliterates Calamity Ganon in an epic cutscene battle before she then reverts back to her previous form before it's too late, and restores the Triforce of Wisdom back to normal. Ganon has been destroyed, you've won. Except, all 3 versions of Hyrule have now also been destroyed, so really nobody won here. And that's my take on how they should handle the story in a Zelda game where the timelines converge. Of course, I imagine it would also have a lot of unique gameplay mechanics and interesting world design and characters, but this was just a rough outline of the plot, not a full-on pitch. Now, this story isn't perfect, mostly in that it builds itself entirely off of pre-existing lore and doesn't have much new to offer, but it does at least offer a much newer take on a lot of that pre-existing lore, although there is still some stuff that's pretty derivative. Of course, this game is meant as a celebration of the entire series, so it makes sense that it wouldn't have that much in the way of new stuff, but also this is only the first draft of the story, so who knows. The new stuff could get added later on. I also do have to mention that this game's take on Ganondorf is somewhat similar to Ganon's appearance in Four Swords Adventures, which also takes place in the Child timeline. So, yeah, I'm just gonna remove that from the timeline. Once again, it would probably be best if this game wasn't the next Zelda game after Tears of the Kingdom, so that people will get the opportunity to take a break from the Kingdom of Hyrule and play a new Zelda game with a more non-traditional story and setting before eventually then giving us this one. Maybe even like a couple new 3D Zelda games. Maybe this will be the Zelda series' 50th anniversary game. Oh god, how many Zelda games am I gonna be able to play before I die of old age? Oh no. Speaking of a different setting though, I think if this game were to be given a sequel, then it would be good for it to focus on the Zonai coming down from the heavens for the first time as was spoken in Tears of the Kingdom, and then they'd bring Link and Zelda back up to the skies with them. That is if another Zelda game doesn't take up that plotline first, because I do think that would be a good way to get us out of Hyrule without just picking up Link and Zelda and then just plopping them in some new kingdom. They're going to visit right when some bad stuff happens in this other kingdom, and then they take it upon themselves to solve all these other people's problems. That's my main problem with going to another kingdom for a Zelda game, but, like, if they, like, went up to the sky, like, the Zonai came down, like it's said happened in Tears of the Kingdom, and, like, they go up, and the entire game takes place on the Sky Islands, that would work. Assuming another Zelda game doesn't take this idea before the Convergence game comes out, then the Convergence game sequel would take place in a new kingdom, populated by numerous Zonai located in the skies above, while also having you go down semi-frequently to visit the ruins of Merged Hyrule. Maybe that would even be, like, another world. Maybe, like, the sky would be one place, Merged Hyrule, but oh, that would just be Tears of the Kingdom again. Oh, never mind. This game's villain would not be Ganon, instead giving the spotlight to someone else in the skies above. It would be a great time to give us a new villain, but I also think it would be cool to bring in someone who isn't Ganon out of retirement for it once. Since we haven't really seen any villains who aren't Ganon return, except for, I guess, Vati through the Four Swords games. And after all, with the timelines having converged now, many evils who had been slain in one timeline would still be alive in the other two. Maybe someone who was with Link and Zelda found an old mysterious mask lying around in the ruins of Hyrule, and when they brought it up to the sky with them, it came alive and took one of the Zonai's secret stones. Or maybe the reason that the Zonai took notice of the surface world finally was because massive parts of it were disappearing into strange rifts in reality, and they wanted to save anyone on the surface before the void consumed the entire thing. Or heck, a game set in the skies would be perfect for a certain someone named Vati the Wind Mage. And of course, new villains are always welcome. There is one last thing I'd like to touch upon though, and that's how this version of Ganondorf could potentially connect to Tears of the Kingdom's Ganondorf. While this game's Ganondorf is a reincarnation, he's still connected to the original Ganondorf and has his memories. Meanwhile, Tears of the Kingdom's Ganondorf is just some other seemingly unrelated dude. That's kinda lame in my opinion, but this game is a prequel to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, so maybe there's something we could do to connect Tears' Ganondorf to this game's Ganondorf retroactively? The origins of Tears of the Kingdom's Ganondorf is pretty vague. We don't even know where he got his gloom magic from, he just has it. But as I said, this game's Ganondorf can also use gloom. It's a power he learned from studying the writings of Twinrova, which was then amplified by the Triforce. So during this game's ending, while Calamity Zelda is like nuking Calamity Ganon, young Ganondorf, who's inside Calamity Ganon, sort of piloting it like a mech thing in juxtaposition to Breath of the Wild Calamity Ganon, where that Ganon was just formed from leaking power from a still sealed Ganondorf underneath Hyrule Castle. Anyway, young Ganondorf will use the little time he has left to send out whatever gloom remains after his destruction out to find a new host. One who will inherit his power and his hatred in order to continue what young Ganondorf has started. It will be implied, or maybe shown in a post-credit scene even, that hundreds of years later, this bloom finds the Ganondorf from Tears of the Kingdom, and takes him as its host. Maybe not the best way to connect Tears' Ganondorf to the rest of the timeline, and it also explains where Ganondorf got his powers from, so I think it works quite well. And that's the video. Please tell me what you think in the comments on whether this is actually a good idea or not. A game like this would be fan service galore, but there would also be some issues that it would need to sort out. I know the whole timeline convergence thing is a controversial theory among fans, but if it is true, then I sure as heck want a game that thing. And not just Hyrule Warriors, that was definitely not what they were trying to do there. We can only hope that Aonuma will play more mind to the story as we move forward. If Echoes of Wisdom's story tells us anything, it's that they're trying to course correct after the mixed reception of Tears of the Kingdom story. And, well, this would be one way to shut the complainers up, that's for sure. Say what you will about this idea, but it does not neglect the game's story. But please, tell me what y'all think. As far as I know, the ideas in this video are those of a crazed lunatic who should never be allowed to touch any game story. And since I'm studying game development at college, if that's the case, then I'd like to know. Thank you for watching.